It was meant to be the happiest day of their lives. But since that sweltering morning in 1981, no one ever saw Benedito and Nice again. The village of São Geraldo dos Buritis, in the north of Minas Gerais, was home to fewer than 800 souls back then. Most of the houses were adobe, with clay-tiled roofs and barbed wire fences. A battery-powered radio was the main source of news, and Sunday Mass was the heart of the community's social life. Benedito drove a tractor on his father-in-law's farm and was known as a serious yet gentle man. Nice taught the village children and had lived with her grandmother since the untimely death of her parents. They had been together for 3 years, and their wedding was set to be the biggest event of the decade. The church hall was adorned with wildflowers picked from the savannah, and the pews were draped with cloths hand-embroidered by the women of the community. The ceremony began at 4 in the afternoon under a clear blue sky that made everything feel more beautiful. The bride arrived in a horse-drawn cart wearing a simple white lace dress made by a seamstress from the nearby town of Paracatu. He waited for her at the altar, smiling, dressed in a light-colored suit borrowed from a cousin. The only photographs were taken with a borrowed film camera. One of them, the one that became the case's most iconic image, shows the two embracing, smiling in front of the house where they were supposed to start their new life. But what that photograph doesn't reveal is that on the morning after the wedding, Benedito and Nice vanished without a trace. They were last seen around 10 o'clock at night, bidding their guests farewell and walking toward the small house they had prepared. There were no electric lights on the dirt roads. Only the moon lit their path. The house stood about 600 meters from the church. It was a simple 2-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a double bed, and a new wardrobe Benedito had assembled weeks before. The next day, the maid of honor went to deliver a wedding gift, a set of aluminum pots, and found the front door ajar. The bed was perfectly made, the clothes in their suitcase still neatly folded, and the food from the previous night was untouched. The strangest detail, according to accounts from the time, was that both of their pairs of shoes were there, side by side, in a corner of the room, as if they had simply stepped out of them and decided never to return. The news spread quickly, but with no telephone or police station in the village, the search was slow to begin. Family and neighbors made the first attempts, combing the rural surroundings for days. There was no sign, no cry for help, no note, no witnesses. For many, it was impossible to accept that such a devoted couple would simply disappear hours after exchanging their vows. Theories began to circulate. A family feud, revenge from an ex-lover, a planned escape, or involvement in something far more dangerous. But none of it made sense when considering the quiet, peaceful lives of Benedito and Nice. Her grandmother, Donna Hilda, never believed they had left on their own. Every Sunday for 9 consecutive years, she would place white flowers in front of the little church where her granddaughter was married. She never missed a single Sunday, and even when she began to forget her neighbors' names, she still remembered the smile on Nice's face in that lace dress. It wasn't until 1990, 9 years after the disappearance, that an unexpected discovery brought the long-buried story back to life. A fisherman on the São Francisco River, some 200 kilometers away, found a leather suitcase floating slowly among the branches of a small tributary. It was an old-fashioned suitcase with metal clasps and a rigid frame. It was partially open, and inside was something he would never forget, a wedding dress, still damp, carefully folded beside a pressed flower, and a wedding band engraved with the initials N and B. The fisherman's name was Elias. He had lived for over 30 years on the banks of the São Francisco, where the river slows and forms deep pools surrounded by twisted trees and sounds only the locals understand. He was a man of few words, one who avoided trouble but missed nothing. That morning, as he paddled slowly, he spotted the suitcase adrift, caught in the branches. At first he thought it was trash, but as he hooked it, he realized it was an old leather case, weathered by time and smelling strongly of mildew. When he opened it, he saw the damp white fabric, the carefully preserved flower, and, what startled him most, a small woman's wedding ring. Elias took the suitcase to the home of a friend, a retired police officer named Ademar, who immediately recognized the potential significance. Examining the ring with an old magnifying glass, Ademar felt a jolt of memory. The initials matched a cold case he vaguely remembered hearing about on the radio years ago, the disappearance of a couple from the interior of Minas Gerais. The suitcase was turned over to the police. The news traveled slowly, as everything does in that region. It reached São Geraldo dos Buritis a week later, carried by a traveling salesman. When Dona Hilda heard that a suitcase had been found with a dress and a ring, she collapsed on her porch, speechless for hours. The town fell still. The local radio station resurrected the case. People who barely remembered Nice's name began digging through drawers for yellowed newspaper clippings. The dress was identical. The flower was a dahlia, the same kind Benedito had placed in her hair after the ceremony. But most haunting was the condition of the clothes. There were no signs of mud, blood, or tearing. Everything seemed to have been carefully preserved despite the years. How could the suitcase have traveled 200 kilometers to end up there? The river's current wasn't direct. It made no sense. Someone must have brought it there, and more than that, who keeps a wedding dress for 9 years only to cast it into a river? Benedito's younger sister, Nade, was called to identify the items. She wept as she touched the lace fabric, confirming it was the dress. The suitcase, she said, had also belonged to the family, inherited from their father. With the identification confirmed, only one question remained. Where were the bodies? As investigators pursued this new trail, a memory surfaced. In the week before the wedding, Benedito had argued with a man from a neighboring town, a man named Agenor, who had been infatuated with Nice in his youth. Rumors resurfaced that Agenor had been seen on the day of the wedding, standing on the dirt road watching the bride's carriage from a distance. He had never been seriously questioned and had since moved away. Now, with the suitcase reappearing nearly a decade later, his name was on everyone's lips. But what troubled the families most was the chilling sense that someone somewhere still knew exactly what happened that night in 1981. With the suitcase in custody and the story gaining traction, the Minas Gerais civil police dispatched a team to São Geraldo dos Buritis to reconstruct the events of that night. The town, which had long held its silence, began to talk, to remember, and to fear. The original 1981 investigation had been closed after just a few months for lack of evidence. Now, in 1990, with new techniques and more resources, there was hope that the truth might finally emerge. The team started at the house where Benedito and Nice were to have spent their wedding night. The structure was still standing, though derelict, with tall weeds choking the path. Inside, time seemed to have stopped. Remnants of their trousseau lay intact. Termite trails scarred the walls, and a crochet bedspread was still stretched over the mattress as if waiting for someone to return. It was there that police found the first concrete clue. Buried behind the house, under a poorly laid slab of concrete, was a small plastic-wrapped package. Inside was a white handkerchief embroidered with the initials M.I. and a crumpled envelope containing a note. The ink had faded, but with expert help they deciphered part of the message. "You know I never accepted this. You will regret it. If he loves you, let him prove it in the dark." The handwriting was aggressive and threatening. The initials M.I. meant nothing to the family but an elderly resident, a 78-year-old woman named Dirce, recalled a story about a woman named Marlene Innocencia who had been Benedito's first love. They had dated for 3 years, she said, but broke up when he went to work on his future father-in-law's farm. Marlene, heartbroken, had reportedly never gotten over him. Her name had never appeared in the original inquiry. Locating Marlene in 1990 wasn't difficult. She lived alone in a modest house in a nearby town, known for being reclusive and bitter. When questioned, she denied any involvement, but her nervousness was palpable. She claimed to know nothing of any letter or any suitcase. But then a former clerk from the local registry office revealed that 3 weeks after the couple's disappearance, a woman using documents in the name of Ana das Dores had attempted to register a civil marriage. The signature matched Marlene's. Furthermore, there was no official record of any Ana das Dores in the entire region. The certificate was never completed because the woman vanished before the final signature. A search warrant was issued for Marlene's home. In the attic, they found a small wooden box containing 2 black and white portraits, one of Benedito, one of Nice, and a third torn photo showing only Marlene's face. In the same box was a scrap of torn lace identical to the kind on Nice's wedding dress. Meanwhile, back in January, the fisherman Elias returned to the spot where he had found the suitcase. The river's water level had begun to drop, and what he discovered was even more disturbing. Tangled in the exposed roots of a large tree, a second, smaller suitcase was emerging from the hardened mud. It was made of the same leather as the first, its lock still fastened. When forensics finally opened it, they found something that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. 2 pairs of shoes carefully wrapped in cotton cloths, one for a man, one for a woman, still bearing the dried mud from the night of the disappearance. And at the bottom of the case, a small Bible was open to the book of Genesis, a dried petal marking the verse about the day and the night. The evidence was beginning to align: a written threat, a possible false identity, and 2 symbolic objects cast into the river years apart. It was the work of someone who seemed to want to be remembered but not seen. In the days that followed, the discovery of the second suitcase changed the atmosphere in São Geraldo dos Buritis. Silence gave way to tension. The mystery, once a distant memory, now felt like a predator lurking in the shadows. The lead detective, Jonas Carvalho, decided to concentrate his efforts along the riverbanks. With the help of the Navy and local fishermen, a sweeping search began, using grappling hooks, divers, and sniffer dogs battling the difficult swampy terrain. It was as if something hidden for nearly a decade was slowly, inexorably rising to the surface. And no one was sure if they were truly ready to know everything. It was during one of these searches that one of the dogs drew close to a bend in the river known as Bat's Bend, a place choked by thick trees, gnarled roots lurking beneath the water, and a bed of dark, viscous mud. There, a little more than a meter deep, divers found the moldy remnants of fabric caught on a submerged branch. After more careful digging, they located a piece of human bone, apparently from an arm. Forensic analysis confirmed it was a human humerus, showing signs of prolonged exposure to water. There were subtle marks like scratches or cuts, but no definitive conclusion could be drawn immediately. Still, the possibility of finally locating the bodies gave the investigation new life. Meanwhile, Dona Hilda, Nissy's grandmother, received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man with a slow drawl and a northeastern accent appeared at her house late in the afternoon, saying he had something to confess. His name was Pedro Lins, and he claimed to have worked for 3 months on the farm of Benedito's father-in-law back in 1981. What he revealed would change the course of the story. According to Pedro, on the eve of the wedding, he overheard a heated argument between Benedito and his father-in-law, Mr. Honorio. The dispute was over an old debt and a demand. Benedito could not marry Nisi without first signing a document waiving his right to the portion of land he would inherit should Honorio die. Pedro didn't know if Benedito had signed it or not, but what frightened him most was what he saw the following morning. The couple's room still neatly made, the gate open, and Honorio's car parked outside, its tires caked in mud, unusual for a man who rarely went out at night. The police turned their attention to Mr. Honorio, now 70 years old and living in isolation on a small farm off the BR 135 highway. When interrogated, he refused to speak about the past, limiting himself to saying, "Everyone reaps what they sow." The cryptic phrase became the subject of town gossip for days. But the most delicate point emerged from a detail no one had noticed until then. On the religious marriage certificate, the priest had noted that the bride and groom had signed with a blue pen. Yet on the civil version, registered 3 days before their disappearance, Benedito had signed with a black pen. It was too small a detail to have been noticed at the time. But now, a handwriting expert was called to analyze the documents. The report was conclusive. The signature at the registry office was not Benedito's. It was a crude forgery. The strokes were hesitant, the pen pressure irregular. Someone had impersonated him to formalize the marriage before the day of the religious ceremony. But why? A new hypothesis began to take shape, one that involved not only jealousy and revenge, but also financial interests and unlikely alliances. If someone wanted to stop the wedding, for love or for money, perhaps they had devised a plan to maintain appearances, only to erase the evidence immediately after. The tension mounted when rumors surfaced that Nisi's body might have been buried, not thrown into the river as imagined. A 90-year-old woman who lived nearby claimed that during that week, she had seen strange activity in the early hours of the morning, near an old disused well behind the municipal school. The site had been sealed in 1982 due to the risk of collapse and had never been reopened. With authorization from the city, excavators were brought to the site. Journalists began to arrive. A commotion swept through the small town, and at noon on Tuesday, an excavator struck a hollow section at the bottom of the well. The silence that followed was absolute. Inside, among rotten planks and loose stones, were remnants of floral fabric, 2 rusted wedding rings and bone fragments, one of which still had part of a ring attached to the finger bone. It was the same model of ring that Nisi had worn at the ceremony. Forensics took everything, but one thing was already certain. This was no mere coincidence. What remained to be known was who put Nisi there. And what had they done with Benedito? The excavation of the old school well brought back more than just bones and rings. It brought back, with full force, the feeling that something terrible had been hidden right under the town's nose. For nearly a decade, São Geraldo dos Buritis had lived with the mystery, never imagining that the remains of one of the victims lay just meters from where children played every day. The forensic report confirmed what everyone feared. The bone fragments belonged to Nitze de Fatima, the missing bride. Her dental records, still partially preserved, were identified by a dentist from a neighboring town who had treated her shortly before the wedding. The rings, though corroded, were an exact match to the pair Benedito had commissioned in Unai. But the report also revealed something unexpected. Nice had not drowned, as had been speculated. She had been asphyxiated. There were pressure marks on her hyoid bone, consistent with manual strangulation. This completely changed the direction of the investigation. They now knew it was not just a disappearance. It was a premeditated homicide. Detective Jonas Carvalho focused his efforts on 3 main suspects: Marlene Inocencia, Benedito's ex-girlfriend, whose obsessive behavior and forged documents placed her under heavy suspicion. Agenor, Nice's ex-boyfriend who had been seen watching the wedding from a distance, and Mr. Honorio, the bride's father, whose silence and potential financial conflicts with his son-in-law raised serious doubts. It was at this point that a new witness emerged, one who had remained silent out of fear. Joãozinho Batista, who was 14 at the time, used to help with milk deliveries from Mr. Honorio's farm. Now, at almost 24 in 1990, he appeared at the Paracatu police station saying that on the night of the disappearance, he saw something he never had the courage to report. According to Joãozinho, he was returning from a friend's house when he saw a car stopped behind the small church. Inside, 3 people were arguing, an older man, a younger man, and a woman with dark hair. He didn't recognize their faces, but he remembered one thing. The woman was crying. The younger man was shouting, and the older man was trying to separate them. The car then sped off toward the dirt road that led to the Retiro farm reservoir. This information was vital. The reservoir had never been searched. It was an artificial dam used for irrigation, but it had partially dried up that year due to a prolonged drought. The next morning, the search team went there. With the help of volunteers and divers from the Montes Claros region, they began to sweep the area. The bottom of the reservoir was dense, dark, filled with sediment and old debris. But on the second day, near the spillway, one of the divers found something caught between the rocks. A nearly complete skeleton with men's clothing in an advanced state of decomposition but still recognizable. A light-colored shirt, a leather belt, and a crucifix tied around the neck with a piece of string. Benedito's family confirmed it. He always wore that crucifix, a gift from his mother. The body had been bound with a thin wire around the ankles, and a 20-kilogram stone was tied to his chest with old rope. Benedito had been thrown in there, either dead or alive. The forensics couldn't confirm, but the manner of death was different from Nice's. While she had been suffocated, he had been submerged with a weight, possibly while unconscious. The difference in execution pointed to something important. Someone wanted her silenced directly, personally, and they wanted him to disappear without a trace. This duality led investigators to a new hypothesis. It wasn't a single perpetrator, but 2 accomplices. Someone who hated Benedito, someone who envied Nice, and someone with the power and opportunity to cover it all up in silence. The question was no longer just what happened, but who, among the living, was still keeping this secret and why. The confirmation of Benedito and Nice's deaths had a profound impact on São Geraldo dos Buritis. What had been treated for years as an inexplicable tragedy now took the shape of a double homicide, with complex motives rooted in jealousy, control, family honor, and a conspiracy of silence. Dona Ilda spent days without leaving her house. When she finally appeared on her porch one overcast morning, she was dressed in black from head to toe. She wasn't crying. She just held a portrait of her granddaughter on her wedding day with both hands. They made her disappear to silence what she knew, she repeated in a low voice, as if speaking only to herself. But now God has pulled the right thread. Forensics reinforced what was already suspected. Benedito and Nice had not died at the same time, nor in the same place. Benedito's clothes were dry before they entered the water, indicating he was already dead or unconscious when he was thrown in. Nice's clothes, however, bore traces of clay soil consistent with the earth from the well. Everything suggested the murders were meticulously planned or at the very least executed with cold precision. Detective Jonas put together a new timeline, cross-referencing the data that had emerged in recent weeks. Something stood out. Between the wedding night and the following morning, there was a window of exactly 4 hours in which the newlyweds vanished before people started looking for them. No one had heard screams, no nearby house had seen any strange activity. But then came a detail that had gone unnoticed for years, from the memory of a woman named Geralda who had been the church cleaner at the time. She recounted that on the morning after the wedding, while sweeping the church entrance, she found a man's shoe tucked under a seat bench. It was new, but soiled with mud. She thought little of it, assuming someone had lost it during the party. But when she described the shoe to the police, brown leather, thick sole, light stitching, the description perfectly matched the shoes Benedito's father-in-law had given him as a gift days before the wedding. The question that immediately arose was, why was Benedito's shoe there and not at the house where he was supposed to have spent the night with Nice? The only logical explanation was that, at some point during the night, Benedito had returned to the church or had been taken there. This reopened a theory that had been forgotten since the beginning, that the two had never made it home that night. Reanalyzing the accounts, the police realized that no witness had actually seen the couple enter the house. Everyone had just assumed that when they said their goodbyes and walked down the dirt road together, they had gone straight there. What if instead they had been intercepted on the way? With this in mind, the police began a new search of the area around the church and the path between the reception hall and the house. A groundskeeper who lived on a small farm along that path was sought for questioning. He was a reserved man who had never been interrogated at the time. His name was Claudio. Now in his 60s, he still lived on the same property, raising cattle and growing vegetables to sell at the market. When approached, Claudio denied having seen anything, but one detail caught their attention. He knew the exact model and color of the horse-drawn carriage the newlyweds had used, an unusual detail for someone who supposedly hadn't even attended the ceremony. Under pressure, he finally confessed a vital piece of information. He said that on that night, around 11 o'clock, he had heard the sound of a carriage returning in the opposite direction. Minutes later, he heard agitated voices and the sound of a car accelerating toward the farm road. He had said nothing at the time out of fear. In those days, he said, crossing certain families was an invitation to disappear yourself. And when the detective showed him photos of Marlene, Agenor, and Mr. Honorio, Claudio hesitated at only one image. The one of Agenor. That one, he murmured. That's the one who drove by in the middle of the night. This statement put Agenor back at the center of the investigation. At the time, he had moved to the interior of Mato Grosso, where records showed he was living as a ranch hand on a remote farm. The Minas Gerais police contacted the neighboring state, and a week later, he was located living in a simple wooden house with a wife and 2 small children. He was brought in for questioning. Initially, Agenor denied any involvement. He said he didn't even know about the wedding, that he hadn't had contact with Nice in years, and that he had left for Mato Grosso for work. But it took only 20 minutes of interrogation for his tone to change. When Detective Jonas placed the photo of the suitcase found in the river, with the dress and the pressed flower on the table, something in Agenor's face broke. His hand trembled. His gaze fell. And then, for the first time in 9 years, someone began to tell the truth. Agenor's silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was one of those heavy silences where you can feel time itself bend. When he finally lifted his eyes to meet Detective Jonas's, what came out was not a simple confession. It was a broken, confused account, punctuated by short breaths and words that seemed to cause him pain as they escaped. He said he hadn't killed anyone, that he hadn't laid a hand on Nice. But he confirmed it. He had been in São Geraldo dos Buritis on the night of the wedding. He explained that he couldn't bear the thought of seeing her with another man. She was mine, he muttered, more to himself than to the room. She always was. He said he had arrived in town via the old road, hiding all day in an abandoned shed at the edge of the village. And at night, he had approached the church to watch the ceremony from a distance. When he saw Nice arrive on the arm of her great-uncle, he forgot to breathe for a few seconds. He just stood there, paralyzed. Then he approached the horse-drawn cart that was meant to take them home. He said that on impulse he had tied a cloth over his face and laid in wait. As the couple walked along the dirt path, Agenor supposedly emerged from the shadows and confronted them. He just wanted to talk to her, he repeated. Just a conversation. But the other man got in the way. Benedito, he claimed, came at him. The two men fought. And it was in that moment Agenor insisted that he heard the sound of an approaching car. High beams, an old engine. He said he ran, fled into the brush and saw nothing more. He denied taking Benedito's body. He denied laying a hand on Nice. But he said that days later someone left a suitcase in front of the boarding house where he was staying in Januaria. When he opened it, he found the dress and a handwritten letter. It told him to keep his mouth shut or he'd end up at the bottom of the river too. The letter disappeared. He said he burned it out of fear. But he kept the suitcase without knowing why. He carried it with him for years, and then one day, at the height of his guilt, he cast the suitcase into the São Francisco River, hoping someone would find it. Agenor's version seemed plausible in parts, but fragile in others. What the police knew for certain was that the suitcase and the dress had come from someone who knew too many details about the wedding night. And what stood out most was the letter he mentioned, a threat made with personal details in a tone far too intimate for a stranger. The possibility of a second person at the scene was gaining strength again. Someone who had arrived by car. Someone who saw what happened between Agenor and Benedito, and who used the confusion to act. But who? It was at this point that a new discovery emerged, and it came from a place no one expected. The old city registry office. While reviewing old civil marriage records, a clerk found, tucked between yellowed papers and unfinished entries, an unmarked envelope glued to the inside back cover of a ledger. Inside was a single sheet with just 4 handwritten words. The signature, a fake. All of it, a setup. The note, anonymous, seemed to have been hidden there deliberately. The handwriting was neat, with rounded strokes very similar to that found in school notebooks from the era. Delegate Jonas sent the paper for analysis, and the result was staggering. The handwriting matched the school records of only one person, Nade, Benedito's younger sister. When confronted, she denied any involvement. She claimed she must have written it after hearing someone comment on it, or perhaps out of fear, and had hidden it to stay out of trouble. But the truth was that Nade knew far more than she had ever let on. She was the only one who knew about the dispute with her father-in-law. The only one who had been with Benedito on the morning of the wedding, when he revealed he would only sign the inheritance papers. After the religious ceremony, not before, defying Honorio's demands. By now, the police had assembled a working hypothesis. Agenor ambushes the couple on the path. Benedito reacts. A fight breaks out. A car approaches, driven by Honorio, who had been following them from a distance. Honorio witnesses the struggle and, instead of helping, seizes the opportunity. Benedito is struck, possibly by his own father-in-law, and taken away in the car. Nice, in shock, is quickly silenced. Strangled and buried in the well. Honorio, to maintain appearances, forges signatures, manipulates the registry, and buys silence in exchange for protection or money. The suitcase, sent or planted by someone. Perhaps by Marlene, perhaps by need, perhaps by someone who knew too much, and remained quiet until remorse outweighed fear. Delegate Jonas was close to a conclusion. But before he could interrogate Honorio one last time, the old man disappeared from the farm where he lived. In the shed, only a single sheet of paper remained, nailed to the wooden door. On it, a sentence written in large letters like a crooked epitaph. Some things are better off dying with us. Honorio's flight was met with a mixture of frustration and confirmation. To many, his sudden departure was a confession without words. He was the last living link, the one person who could fill the remaining gaps in the story. But now, it seemed he was determined to take his secrets with him. Delegate Jonas ordered an immediate search of the surrounding area. Helicopters were dispatched from Montes Claros. K-9 units scoured the farm, but the old man seemed to have vanished into thin air. No sign of a break-in, no clear footprints. The only clue was a gas receipt found in the kitchen, issued that very morning at a station in Paracatu. It indicated that Honorio had access to money, a car, and most likely help. This last part bothered the delegate more than anything. Honorio was an influential man with old connections in several cities across northern Minas Gerais. It wasn't hard to imagine someone sheltering him, someone who still saw him not as a murderer, but as an authority to be respected. Meanwhile, the forensic team was running the final tests on the skeletal remains. The DNA from the bodies was cross-referenced with that of family members. And at last, the scientific confirmation was absolute. Benedito and Nice had been dead since their wedding night. His cause of death, however, remained inconclusive. The examination couldn't determine if there were severe internal injuries before submersion. But the weight tied to the body clearly indicated a deliberate attempt at concealment. The population of São Geraldo reacted as if waking from a long slumber. For nearly 10 years, they had lived with the mystery as a part of their daily lives. But now, with each new revelation, a collective wound was torn open again. People who had once been discreet began seeking out the police station to share small memories, old suspicions, gossip that had seemed insignificant at the time. And among these voices, one stood out. It was Zizico, the church's former sacristan, a frail man with a slow, deliberate way of speaking who had been just over 40 at the time of the disappearance, and who now, due to a heart condition, lived as a recluse with his sister. He told them that on the night of the wedding he had stayed late at the church, putting away the floral arrangements. Around 10:30 he heard voices by the side of the church. One of them, a woman, sounded like she was pleading. He went to the side door and saw, in the distance, a car parked with its hood open. 3 people were arguing, a woman, a younger man, and an older man. The woman seemed to be trying to separate the 2 men. Zizico didn't recognize any of them, but he recalled a curious detail. The woman was wearing a dark dress with a white lace collar and had a large necklace. A detail that seemed random, until investigators went back to the few photographs taken at the wedding. In one of them, captured minutes before the ceremony, a woman could be seen among the guests in the background, with those exact features. Dark dress, white collar, large necklace. It was Marlene Inocencia. The conclusion was swift. She had been at the wedding disguised among the guests, and no one had noticed. This reinforced the theory that Marlene knew what was going to happen, or at the very least was there to ensure that something went according to plan. But when they went to find her for further questioning, her house was locked. Inside, there was no sign of a struggle, but no trace of her either. Neighbors said they saw a car pick her up in the pre-dawn hours of the previous day, driven by a man in a hat who barely got out of the vehicle. It was as if, once again, the ghosts of the story were slipping through the cracks. The delegate, now aware that the case had become bigger than any other in his career, did what few would. He released part of the information to the press, hoping public pressure would force the remaining players to make a move, to give something away, and it worked. The following week, an anonymous letter was left in the police station's mailbox. No return address, typewritten on yellowed paper with a single signature at the end. The one who could no longer bear the silence. The content was direct, almost clinical. I didn't kill them, but I knew. From the beginning, I saw what they did to her. I saw her body being taken to the well. I stayed quiet because they promised to take care of me, of my daughter. But the guilt became a plague. Every night she comes back to me in her soiled dress, her eyes empty of air. It was supposed to be just a scare, but he lost control. Then the other one wanted to solve the problem his way. I was just the link. Now let everyone pay as they must. A forensic analysis of the letter found fragments of pen ink between the typewriter marks. By comparing it with old notes from the investigation, they were able to identify the handwriting. It belonged to Nade. Benedito's sister, the one who had seemed the most innocent, the most grief-stricken, was the connection between them all. The only one who knew the couple's routine, the family conflicts, and who likely knew where and when every piece would move on that night. She was arrested and held in preventive custody, but the puzzle was far from solved. Nade's arrest sent a deep shock through the community. To many in São Geraldo dos Buritis, she was just the caring sister, the young woman who helped at Mass, who sold cornbread at the market. But to Delegate Jonas, she was now the missing key, the only living witness to everything that truly happened on the night of November 21st, 1981. At first, Need denied it. She said the letter wasn't hers, that she was being freed, that she would never harm her own brother. But the evidence was overwhelming. The handwriting matched the note left at the registry. The typewriting matched an old machine kept at the school where she taught, and there was another detail. The letter was written on the same type of paper used by the local parish in the 1980s, a stock that only she and the sacristan had access to. Faced with this, and after nearly 6 hours of silence in the interrogation room, Need finally spoke. Her confession was not a simple revelation. It was an emotional, painful narrative, as if the words had accumulated too much weight over the years. Crying softly, she said she never wanted it to be this way, that it all began with fear, and that by the time she realized what was happening, it was already too late. According to her account, she learned of the plan by accident. She found her father, Honorio, talking with Marlene behind the farm's shed. She listened from a hiding place as the two argued that Benedito needed to disappear before he could sign anything. Marlene wanted to give him a scare, stage a kidnapping, force Benedito to abandon the marriage. Honorio saw it as an opportunity to rid himself of a son-in-law he had never accepted. The initial plan was to intercept the couple after the party and force them to flee. Marlene would drive the car. Agenor would help with the distraction. But it all spiraled out of control. Benedito fought back against the ambush. He struck Agenor. He tried to protect Nice. That's when Honorio appeared. He struck Benedito with a piece of wood. He collapsed. Marlene panicked. Nice screamed. She tried to run. It was then, according to Nidu, that her father strangled her. With his bare hands. Quick. Cold. Without a word. Marlene fell apart in shock. Honorio ordered them to put Nice's body in the trunk. Benedito was still breathing but unconscious. He was placed in the back seat, tied up. The car sped towards the farm. There they separated the bodies. Marlene, in a trance, took Nice's dress and the flower from her hair. She kept them as if they were pieces of a private mourning. Nade, in silence, watched her father carry Benedito to the reservoir, watched him tie a stone to the body, watched him throw it in. He sank without waking, she said. He didn't even move. Nice, buried in the well, was thrown there on Honorio's orders, and it fell to Nade to remain silent. Out of fear, out of shame, a blind loyalty to a father who had always controlled everyone and everything. When the investigation was reopened, Need thought the secret would go back to sleep. But when she saw the suitcase floating in the river, she realized someone else knew, someone angry, someone who had held on to more than just memories. She suspected Marlene. She always had a dark side. She didn't want Benedito back. She wanted him to suffer for choosing Nice. And there was more. Nada recounted that in the weeks following the crime, Marlene had tried to kill herself twice. Then she vanished. She was only seen again years later in Chapadao do Céu, living as if nothing had ever happened. Delegate Jonas, having heard it all, asked one last thing. Why did she decide to speak now? Her answer was short, because after so much time, the silence had begun to hurt more than the truth. Nada's confession allowed the police to issue a formal arrest warrant for Honorio, now a fugitive, and another for Marlene, whose participation, even if not as the executioner, made her an active accomplice in 2 murders. But time was beginning to run out. On the border of Goiás, with Mato Grosso do Sul, a car with an altered license plate was found abandoned by a creek. Inside were men's clothes, prescription medications. And, in the glove compartment, a farewell letter signed with the initials M.I. It was Marlene. Her body was never found, only footprints at the edge of the embankment ending at the shallow water. The police considered suicide, but Delegate Jonas wasn't convinced. To him, she knew too much to simply disappear like that. Honorio, on the other hand, remained invisible, but a new detail would change the course of the hunt. An anonymous tip pointed to him hiding in the same state where Benedito's suitcase had surfaced 9 years earlier. The river, it seemed, had not yet given up all its secrets. The search for Honorio took a new direction. An anonymous tip indicated he was hiding in a riverside community between Januaria and Manga, a region of difficult access where the São Francisco River snaked through dense forests, small islands, and isolated residents who lived with almost no contact with the urban world. The team, led by Detective Jonas, set out in small boats with support from the Navy and local guides. For days, they traveled up and down stretches of the river, listening to fishermen, observing trails, and asking about a quiet, white-haired man who had arrived without saying where he came from. On the 4th day of the search, they came to a house on stilts built on the banks of a narrow creek. A resident confirmed it. A man matching that description had appeared there months earlier, saying he was fleeing the chaos of the city. He paid in cash, was polite, but accepted no visitors. He hardly ever went out during the day. The police discreetly surrounded the house at dawn. When they knocked on the door, the man didn't try to run. He opened it calmly, like someone who had been expecting this moment. It was Honorio. His physical state was deplorable. He was emaciated, his skin burned by the sun, his eyes sunken. In his pocket, he carried only a white handkerchief and a small notebook. He was arrested without resistance. On the way back, he remained in absolute silence, refusing water, food, and questions. At the police station, the scene felt surreal. The man who had controlled everything for so long now sat at the same table where his daughter had confessed to her crime. When Detective Jonas first questioned him, he simply said, "If you already know, why ask?" But the mere mention of Nice's name was enough to provoke a reaction. His eyes welled with tears. It was the first and only time. Still, he refused to sign any confession. He said only that he did what he thought was right to protect the family name. And in a low voice, he murmured, "They were going to leave, get married, sign papers, divide the land. She knew I was against it. And him, he thought he could stand up to me in my own home. But I come from a time when a father's word was law." The detective understood right then what lay behind it all. Pride. an old bitter pride, rooted in an outdated model of masculinity, where control was confused with honor and love with possession. During the trial, Need gave a new testimony. This time, she was more serene. She said she would carry the guilt for the rest of her life, but that she could no longer bear to be an accomplice to a crime that had killed the only two people she truly loved. Honorio, on the other hand, remained cold. He denied until the very last moment that he had ever touched Nice. He claimed she had died of fright. The forensic evidence had already proven otherwise, but he seemed to prefer his own version of the story. He was sentenced to 32 years in prison for murder with 2 aggravating circumstances and concealment of a body. He served the first 2 years in Montes Claros but was later transferred to a prison hospital where he spent most of his time. He died shortly after from respiratory complications, without ever having received a single visitor. Marlena Innocencia was never found. Some believe she took her own life on the night she left her car by the creek. Others say she fled with the help of a distant relative and now lives hidden in some town in the interior of Goiás, with another name, another face, and perhaps the same empty suitcase. Janor, after serving time for perjury and failure to render aid, returned to Mato Grosso and was never seen again. The fisherman, Elias, who found the suitcase 9 years after the crime, now has his name inscribed in the main square of São Geraldo. The only one who unintentionally untied a knot that many had considered impossible to unravel. Dona Hilda died 3 months after the trial. On her tombstone is an inscription chosen by Nade herself before she was imprisoned. "Now you can rest, my granddaughter. The love they tried to silence has been heard." With the official closing of the case, the town of São Geraldo dos Buritis slowly tried to return to its routine. But the silence of nearly a decade, followed by such profound revelations, left scars that would never be erased. The house where Benedito and Nice were to have lived was never inhabited by anyone else. It still stands with its windows shut and its crooked wire fence, like an involuntary memorial. From time to time, residents leave flowers at the front door, usually on Mondays, the day Nice taught at the little school. A simple gesture, but one heavy with meaning. The well behind the school where she was buried was sealed with concrete and given a small, discreet plaque. No name, just 4 words. Here the silence screamed. Benedito's sister, Naid, was sentenced to 8 years for indirect participation and failure to render aid. She served 3 in a closed regime and was then transferred to house arrest. She now lives in a small town in the Chapada Gaúcha, in a house provided by a distant relative. She rarely speaks to anyone but has allowed a documentary crew to visit once a year to keep the story alive. Not in her name, but in the name of the 2 who could not tell their own version. It was one of these documentarians who in 2005 found an old notebook in a second-hand shop in Paracatu. It was a diary dated 1981 with the initials M.I. on the back cover. The pages were torn, stained with moisture, and the handwriting was messy, but passages coincided with dates and details from the wedding night. One sentence stood out amidst the text: "If he can't be mine, then he will be no one's." The line reinforced what the investigation had already shown. Marlene was not just a witness. She was a central element of the tragedy. Her love for Benedito, mixed with rejection, had become fuel for something much larger than a breakup. A plan constructed in darkness, fed by toxic alliances and the complicity of those who should have protected them. The story of the 2 began to be taught in local schools as part of the citizenship curriculum. Not as a horror story, but as a reminder of what happens when pride overcomes affection, when silence is cultivated as a virtue, and when love is manipulated as possession. In 2021, 40 years after their disappearance, the city inaugurated a simple memorial in front of the old church, with two ceramic plaques. On the first, their names, Nice de Fatima Araujo, Benedito Ribeiro da Luz. On the second, an inscription chosen by Nice's former students. Love does not disappear. It only waits to be remembered with justice. This phrase echoed not only among the town's residents, but throughout Brazil after the story was told in a documentary broadcast on public television. But what impressed the producers most while filming was the account of an elderly woman, a resident of the Riverside region. She told them that for years she had seen a dark-haired woman with a large necklace and a lost gaze walking alone by the river's edge at dusk, always in silence, always carrying a single flower clutched in her fingers. She never spoke to anyone, never answered a greeting. Then one day she simply stopped appearing. The flower she carried, always the same, a pink dahlia. Detective Jonas, now retired, still keeps a copy of the wedding photo given to him by Dona Hilda in her final days. The frame is simple, made of wood darkened by time, but behind it, attached with adhesive tape, is a small note he wrote himself. They deserved another night, another path, but at least now the truth has arrived. In the end, what remained was not just the certainties revealed in reports and confessions. What remained was a town transformed not by the horror of what happened, but by the power of a truth that, even after being suffocated for years, insisted on emerging. The story of Benedito and Nice became a silent landmark in São Geraldo dos Buritis. There are no tourist signs, no sensationalist films. But there is memory. There are names spoken with respect, and there is a kind of justice that, though late, offered a kind of peace, not complete but possible. The suitcase found in the river remains preserved in a display case at the small local police station. The dress, now dry and carefully restored, was donated to the school where Nice taught. It is exhibited behind glass, accompanied by drawings made by current students. Hearts, houses, flowers, and the phrase that repeats most often among them. Teacher Nice, you didn't disappear, you came back. The dam at the Retiro farm was filled in. The area where Benedito's body was thrown came to be called Hope's Bend, a name given by the residents themselves. Some say it is an exaggeration, an attempt to erase what happened there. Others believe it is a way of giving new meaning to the place that tried to swallow the truth. Deep down, the case revealed something more profound than the crime itself. It showed how the most devastating tragedies can be born from the mundane, from everyday gestures, from convenient silences, from unresolved loves and ancient vanities. There was no happy ending, but there was closure. And that, for those who have waited for years, is almost a new beginning. If Benedito and Nice had survived, perhaps today they would be living in that simple two-room house, with children, grandchildren, and a completely different story to tell. Perhaps they would be going to the market together, to Mass, living the invisible details that build a life. But what fate denied, memory rebuilt. Because there are stories that refuse to disappear and people who, even when silenced, eventually find a way to be heard.